Morning, Kevin. How you doing?
I'm magnificent. I'm had to steal an office down here at the MOA planning department. I failed to realize this was a Teams only meeting, so I kind of crashed the building. So.
All right. Well, I'm glad you were able to get hooked up here.
They were extremely.
Let's see. Let me check and see how many members of the committee we have here. Looks like we've got a quorum here right now.
Yep, I saw 4.
Okay. Why don't we give it one more minute in case there's someone else joining a minute late, and we'll get started here. How a person has to look for their sunglasses today. It's pretty bright out there.
No complaints on my end, that's for sure.
No, it's a great change. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started here. Today is October 6th of 2022. It's 11:01 a.m. and this is the Community and Economic Development Committee meeting. We'll start out with introductions. I'm the chair, Pete Peterson, and those go start next, Kevin.
Oh yeah, Vice Chair Kevin Cross, Assembly. Thank you.
Randy Solt.
Great, Randy.
Christopher Constant.
Mr. Constant. Okay.
And the members that are not currently on are Mr. Rivera and Miss Allard. So with the 4 of you, there is a quorum.
Okay, thank you, Mandy. Well, let's maybe they'll join us shortly. And so let's go ahead and get started. Are you going to make an introduction to this first item, Mr. Cross?
Yeah, happy to do so. So this first item, they should have access to both the memorandum as well as the ordinance, is basically to allow third-party structural plan review on residential and commercial construction. So it's important to realize the way the municipality of Anchorage looks at it and the way the building department is, anything that's triplex and larger is considered commercial. Most of your builders and most of your individuals in dealing with banks look at actually residential up through 4plex. They still consider triplexes and 4plexes residential, at least as far as financing terms and stuff, simply because they are able to be occupied. You guys, as we all are well aware, the number of triplexes, 4plexes, multifamily has the number of those being built in Anchorage has dropped off the map, as well as condo complexes, other lots of issues. In fact, I believe yesterday, and I apologize, I wasn't there, but the Alaska Home Builder, the Anchorage Home Builder Association had a presentation, and they talked about how, they've seen a significant drop off in larger multifamily. But we understand multifamily, commercial, as well as, commercial construction, maybe assisted living facilities. A lot of those have diminished in construction. So what this ordinance hopes to does is help facilitate and help accelerate some of the timelines by which those get done without jeopardizing the quality of the construction. Currently, as the code sits, single family and duplexes, when you're doing structural plan review, you're able to utilize a third party. Now, this third party must be licensed. They must have the credentials that would be equal to or greater than anybody at the municipality of Anchorage would have as far as their planning review and their structural approving department. So they would have to be a high-caliber individual with the right licensing requirements and education. And additionally, they would have to have air and emissions insurance at a greater level. So currently it's up to $250,000, but for commercial construction, this ordinance would require a $1 million bonded in insurance policy. So a significantly greater insurance. The intention here is to get the long wait times and the bottleneck that is currently happening in our planning department back into third parties where we can see hopefully some expedited timelines. I will tell you from my conversations, and hopefully we have some individuals from the public that are here, it is not unrealistic to be expecting 6 or 10 months sometimes on a project to get plans reviewed, approved, and finally. And by that time in this market, with our inflation and with what we've seen, how do you budget for that? How do you budget for something when you don't know when you're going to be able to build it or how long it's going to take? That whether you're dealing with labor shortages or material costs, whatever. So something significantly needs to be done with the amount of time. And what we've seen is how successful we have seen this happen for single family and duplex, which they're still building and building in large numbers. But a lot of that is because they're able to get their structural plan review done by neutral third parties who are not subject to the time constraints that municipal employees are. They'll work weekends, they'll work evenings, they'll work whatever they need, holidays, whatever it is to get a job done because they're being paid. And you'll find that the builders will often pay more than going through the municipality or going through our current planning department just to get those expedited timelines. Additionally, we have not seen the quality of construction diminish with single family and duplex. So the argument that you would have that these third-party engineers and architects are not qualified is proven wrong simply because we see the quality of construction continue to increase in duplex and single family, and to be reasonable to think that these same individuals doing structurals on commercial would also be qualified. So this just looks to extend that. Now, it does not eliminate it. An individual is more than welcome to also submit, or they can utilize the municipality for plan approval, for structural plan approval, which we encourage them to do. But it'll also help lighten some of the load that is currently sitting at the municipality, and that will help them expedite their timelines and not feel the burden of the projects and files that they have on their desk. So that's my presentation. You can read through that. Do we have any questions or thoughts?
If any of the committee members have questions, put yourself in the queue. I'm keeping track of it. Excuse me. Mr. Constant.
Thank you. So when I'm reading this, it talks about commercial. It doesn't talk about residential that is larger scale. So what this makes me think about are strip malls and other properties of that nature. And so, I want to know if that's what you're thinking, because you talked about housing that are larger projects. And then I am interested in understanding more about this term neutral, because I have certainly some concerns when you have a builder that does 50 projects a year and they have a third party that does this work for them, and it's always the same company. That's not actually neutral, that's advocate. And so it shifts in some ways the role of that person. And so I'd like to understand what's meant by neutral as well.
Well, neutral is a third party that was not involved in the architectural design. So they're purely providing inspection purposes on the structural plan. So they would, and the builder would be inclined to use, you're right, they could continue to use the same individuals, the same group. The MOA does have within this a right to audit those companies because they have a percentage of files. I think it was 10% that they're encouraged to go through and investigate to make sure that those plans that are coming through are being built to. And I would think if you had a large builder and you saw the same individual coming up with plans, that might be somebody that you would say, hey, listen, they're giving a lot of business to one person. You want to make sure they would have it within the rights to audit those and take a closer look at them as an investor. But to assume that they're just going to do, that they're going to cut corners and do a bad job because they get sent a lot of business, I think is, although it's a concern, I don't know how realistic of a one it is in the real estate business. And a perfect example is home inspectors. Real estate licensees develop relationships with home inspectors. There's probably a handful, there's probably maybe about 8 or 9 home inspection companies that provide independent inspections when a buyer purchases or when a buyer or seller sells a house. It provides independent inspections. Similarly, they're a neutral third party, and a lot of real estate licensees keep sending the same work to the same inspector, but their intention is that that individual is going to rigorously make sure that there are no issues. It is
So
not.
Kevin,
Yeah.
can I jump in there?
Yeah.
So it's interesting that you bring up that example, because in my work in real estate, it's almost always the problem falls in the inspection process, that you have an inspector that does work to a certain quality or misses some things, and people are always coming back, how did this get through? But a closer cognate is the appraisal process that has to ensure fidelity to the bank that the property is in fact quality, that it meets the standards. And what's evolved in the last 20 years, of course, is that the appraiser has to be neutral, truly neutral, meaning the bank selects from a slate, kind of a random draw, and not, John Smith's cousin who runs, the building side, the inspection side, I could name, I won't, but name companies that have lined their family up to be in every step of that process.
Well, and I mean, if you want to use that example, Chris, as you know, I'm very familiar with that process. We both have experience in the real estate industry. And so what you're dealing with, the Dodd-Frank Act of 2009 that came out and required all appraisals to go through the REL system, the revolving electronic listing system. You could argue that helped create a buffer. Remember, it was the field of the real estate industry that they should provide additional audits and more licensing requirements. What was the byproduct of the federal government getting involved in the appraisals? The appraisal costs have more than quadrupled. They quadrupled in a period of less than 4 years. The waiting times on commercial appraisals are 8 and 10 weeks now. Sometimes it can take you 5 to 6 months to close on a commercial loan or on some of your financing because of it. And so now they're actually looking at some of these and so now they're actually looking at peeling back some of these rules that they put in place, realizing that it was detrimental to the market. And so, yeah, I think that's a good example, and we see what happens when it goes too far either direction.
Yep,
This particular one,
that's the term neutral really is important to figure out what that means.
Okay.
Well,
in this particular case,
do we need to come up with a definition somewhere for neutral and put that in here, or is there I'm not sure if exactly the definition of neutral that most people would think of would be exactly the use and how it's being used here. So I don't know, is that something, I'm not sure if Dean is on with us today or not, but we might want to, that's something we might want to consider.
Right, Dean, and Pete, for myself, I've seen where there's like a default agency relationship created between a brokerage and a firm, or a brokerage and another entity, and it might not be legally considered an entity between the two, but because all the business goes that way, it's like a de facto relationship, not neutral.
Well, would you say that
Mr. Gates just sent me a note in the chat that he is available, and so if we could ask him if he thinks a definition of the word neutral is necessary here. Well, what do you think about that, Dean? Do we need to write a definition of neutral for this?
Hello. Yes, this is Dean Gates, and I think that instead of the word neutral, the word that we really are looking for is impartial. And
well, that's good.
but I agree, independent reviewing professional. And I'm sorry, I was looking for the language. I think it's here somewhere because we had it for the residential permit plan review. Some requirement that the plan reviewer has no interest or is a separate business from the contractor or the owner. So the person doing the plan review, the person that developed the plans drafted the plans, so forth are different. But I think the word is really impartial. I'm not sure you need a definition for that. It's a legal term of art, basically.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dean. Well, this is still a draft, so we can make that change, and this would be a good time to do that. And thanks.
I like that. Yeah, I'd like to know Chris's thoughts on changing that to impartial versus neutral.
So I don't understand the fine legal nuance of the difference of the two terms. And so I have to understand that a little bit more. And probably now is not the time. But I just put a note on the table that my one concern in this framework so far is just that potential for a de facto agency relationship to be created. It's like, think about it, different terms out of real estate audits. It's common practice to not always every year have the same auditor. Use the same auditor for a number of years and then switch, because it's easy for an auditor to start missing things because they're so closely affiliated with the ongoing operation, even though they only come in once a year. And so I don't know where that lands, but it's there's something there, because we are in the end talking about building safety. We're not just talking about appurtenances that make a place prettier, or, we're talking about buildings falling down.
Yeah, and at the same time, and I agree that we would not want to see an inappropriate relationship between the contractor and the individual providing the inspections. I agree. Much like we wouldn't want our builders having a deep personal, although there's nothing really prevent it, deep personal relationships with individuals in the planning or approval departments with contractors or developers. Does that influence their work? The same thing could happen with municipal employees. It's not to say that it can't. It only happens in the private sector. That danger of impropriety exists no matter where you go. So how do we create it being more efficient? And the other part of that is what I wouldn't want to see is just a system that ends up just like the appraisal process, where the municipality picks the inspector you get from the private sector, which is kind of what they do for appraisals, right? They say, here's the ones that are approved, they're in our system. You don't get to choose who it is. Because what ended up happening, same thing with like appraisals and other issues, is that's like not being able to pick your plumber and they just draw them out of a hat and you get that guy. And it doesn't matter if they're good, bad, or indifferent. You get assigned who you get assigned. And that did not move things in the right direction. But I'm hoping that this will, the intention of this draft ordinance here is to, again, alleviate the weight that's on the planning department and look to create a continue or equal to or increase the quality of plan review on all construction. And so when we say commercial, again, it is triplex and larger and does include the strip malls and these other items. Now, I do anticipate that in the future, we're going to see some conversions from my hypothesis is in the future, we'll see a decrease in use in some of these large commercial spaces as more people work from home and technologies change. We'll probably look at turning some of these properties into residential, but that's a totally different conversation. But yes, it would be the right of the developer to use a highly qualified, licensed, insured third-party structural review process.
I've got Mr. Gates in the queue, followed by Mr. Whitfield. Go ahead, Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I was mentioned earlier, I was looking for language. It doesn't use the word impartial, actually, but the concept is there. It's on page 4, line 34, the subsection 2b. And it's more direct about specific type of independence from the designer or builder of the project. But so I also wanted to mention Mr. Constant said the difference between neutral and impartial. I think they're rather synonymous and common nomenclature, but just typically in legal language, we use the word impartial. I think, commonly understood to have a similar meaning. Anyways, I think that if we're talking about a different system, though, or managing even more conflicts such as plan review who's got a close personal relationship or is even a family member with a separate business and all that. That you would need additional language here, so that little b doesn't do it. It just provides that you've got to have different people doing the designing or building and the plan review.
So Dean, if I might, Mr. Chair,
Go ahead, Mr. Constant.
I don't think any of that gets to my concern. And my concern is when I read that section, imagine a builder, let's just use a round number, does 100 projects a year. And they use whatever designer that they use for their design. And then they use John Smith Inspection Company plan review for 100 out of 100 projects or 90 out of 100 projects. Even though there's a distinction in law that they are not the same entity, in some ways in practice, they in fact are, because the steady workflow is the same. It's the same people, the same process. It's like that. It's like easy to become blind in those kinds of scenarios. And so that's where my concern lies. I don't see that reflected here. And so I'm not saying I'm stuck on anything personal, black and white yet. This is draft, early conversations, but that's again, not addressed in any of the definitions I've seen or kind of.
I think that your reading is correct there. That doesn't address the situation that you're concerned with. I think that's business relationships and so forth. But yeah, I think we need additional language if you want to prohibit, or like you and Mr. Cross were talking about, revolving system of a random plan review on a list, you know, that rotates, stuff like that. That's a different system than what's written here.
Okay, all right, Mr. Whitfield's next, followed by Mr. Ferguson.
Yes, thank you, Pete, and thank you, Kevin, for giving us an overview of the ordinance and its intent. I would like to make just one small clarification. You mentioned a few times the planning department, and I just want to clarify that Title 23 is development services. They oversee Title 23. The planning department oversees Title 21. So this is not necessary. It doesn't necessarily involve the planning department. So I just want to make that clarification. But thank you for the overview. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Ferguson. You're on mute.
I've got a question on the ordinance. The way I read the ordinance, it discusses structural plan review. Yet we've talked in a couple places about structural inspection. And I believe those are two distinct, different items. Does this ordinance address both structural plan review and structural inspection, or structural plan review only?
Thank you, and thank you for that clarification. This is purely structural plan review.
Okay.
They would still be subject to all the inspections and the permitting process.
Thank you. I built building. I'm representing AGC of Alaska. I built buildings in Anchorage since 1984. I've used the third-party review, most recently on the cement dome for Anchorage sand and gravel at the port. We used a third-party review and it worked very, very well. There have been allusions to contractors building 100 projects a year or something like that. I don't know of any contractor in the state that would be building any number of projects approaching that. And so I think we're talking more about a contractor building 5 or maybe 7 projects a year in Anchorage. So I don't believe using a consistent is that much of a concern. It's still cheaper to use the city for your plan review, and that's going to drive some of the decisions. But I do believe that this ordinance would help speed the plan review process which is necessary. Delays cost money. Anything you can do to mitigate those delays is a step in the right direction. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. And that is what the intent of this ordinance is. If I have been hearing Mr. Cross right, we're hoping to speed up the process. We have a housing shortage along with everyone else, and so we're doing what we can to try to speed it up. Not seeing anyone else in the queue right now.
I have another question, Pete.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Constant.
Thank you. So it was mentioned that the process still maintains the allowance for auditing of the plans. I only see one place, but I don't have it downloaded, so I don't know if I can search very effectively. Yeah, it's only in the document one time, and that's on page 6, line 7 through 9. And what we in fact do with this ordinance is delete the audit process.
See that. What was the intent for deleting the audit process? Can anyone explain that, please?
Forgive me, I'm looking for where he's got that in there because I did not, it was not my intent of deleting the audit process. There was an intent that I think the minimum was 10% of the projects would get.
Kevin, it's page 6 of 7, line 7.
Page 6 of 7, line 7. The building official may audit the reviews conducted by independent reviewing professionals as necessary to enforce provisions of that code.
That section is deleted.
Okay, yeah, we want to put that back in. Thank you, Chris. Hey, Dean,
Yeah,
would you make a note that gets included back in? That was just an oversight by me.
Okay, great. Thanks for noticing that, Mr. Constant. And this is still a draft, and so we can make that change. Fantastic.
Thanks, Chris.
Any other questions? Should we move forward
Mr.
with the
Chairman.
review? Oh, go ahead, Mr. Gates.
Yes, I just wanted to mention, so that subsection H that we just discussed, I will make sure we add that back in. It's not to be deleted, but I just wanted to mention that with or without the language, I don't think anything prevents the building official from doing these audits, you know. So even if it's deleted, the building official can still do this. I guess it's nice to make it explicit in code. But anyways, I'll make sure that it's not deleted by this ordinance.
Okay, great. Appreciate that. Thanks, Mr. Gates. Any additional review of the ordinance that you'd like to do, Mr. Cross?
No, it was important for me to get some feedback on it, and that's why we have these important conversations, and I greatly appreciate the contribution. You know, and once it comes out of this, Department X is now to actually have it move forward and provided those changes, and then we'll probably do, you know, we may elect to do a work session on it before it goes before the assembly. So I greatly appreciate it. I guess the other thing is, you know, we probably have some public testimony. I have brought this before the
We kind of lost you for a second there. You sort of froze up, Mr. Cross. Maybe you could repeat that last couple of sentences.
You know, I am still looking for some additional feedback from the Alaska General Contractors, the Anchorage Home Builders Association, just seeing what their thoughts are on it, as well as any written comments from Development Services here at the MOA. But once we get their input, I'm hoping in maybe within the next week or so, we'll get this in process, and hopefully within the next month, we'll get it before the assembly. Thank you.
Okay,
Excuse me, through the chair.
who am I speaking to? Who?
This is Ross Knopfsinger with Development Services, currently the acting building official.
Go ahead, Ross.
Yeah. So I don't think people are probably aware of this, so I just wanted to provide a few clarifying points. We currently have two outside plan review contracts, one with Kaufman Engineers and one with Reed Middleton Engineers. Should anyone choose to do an outside third-party plan review on a project, they can do so. We've had contracts like this in place for maybe 20 years. As Mr. Ferguson mentioned, this option was used on the cement terminal down at the port. This option has not been used since 2018. No one has elected to go with a private outside plan review in the past 4 years. And basically, and there's reasons for that I can get into or not, but I wanted to get that out there. I was also going to mention that the audit provision somehow disappeared, but it sounds like that's being addressed. One thing that a result of us doing the third-party residential reviews was the building department lost its ISO ranking for residential construction. The municipality of Anchorage now is basically a no rating when it comes to the ISO rating for residential construction, and I assume something like that similar may happen if private plan review becomes popular for commercial buildings. Another thing too is I don't think this has been presented to the building board. And basically, all ordinances that impact or change Title 23 should actually go through the building board as part of their process, where the building board then makes recommendation to the assembly. Okay.
Well, we should probably contact them to make sure they're aware that this is in the process. Mr. Constant.
Thanks. A question for you, Ross. When you said because of the building private permitting plan review process, we lost our ISO rating, was that because we allow independent review or because it's too many and we're not processing enough, so we don't have the kind of applied experience, or what was the cause of that loss, and how does that generalize to the commercial?
So according to ISO, it ended up being the amount of private sector review being done. Basically, the lion's share of 1 and 2 family home construction is being done by private sector reviewers. And it crossed over a threshold, and I forget what that threshold is, whether it's 2/3 or 3/4 of the permits or whatever, is why we lost that ranking. And the ISO basically ranks the effectiveness of the building department in administering codes.
Understood. Thank you.
Okay. Well, it seems to me, that if it was mentioned earlier that if someone was doing 100 projects, they would probably have their own in-house engineer to review those plans. So it makes sense to me that local developers who are doing a half a dozen projects a year are certainly not going to have their own, or more than likely not going to have their own engineer on staff. But Mr. Gates.
Thank you. I just wanted to add a comment about the ISO rating, and I'm not sure, I was multitasking. I'm not sure if Mr. Knopfsinger mentioned this part, but one effect of having a lowered ISO rating would be on insurance rates, and might increase insurance rates for property owners. And so it's I think we all know, getting financing and financial institutions will require insurance, of course. So it's not something you can really get out of as a home buyer or maybe a commercial property buyer or owner. Anyways, so there might be some effect of that ISO ranking. There's something to keep in mind. And I did have a memorandum from a prior building official. I think it was Sharon Walsh, that I can try to dig up and pass on to Mr. Cross, Mr. Constant, or the county, if I can find it, that talked about that effect.
Okay, great. Yeah, if you could find that, we could take a look at that, Mr. Gates. Thanks.
And one more point of clarification through the chair. In regards to the timing, currently we handle that by issuing phased permits. Like we will issue an excavation permit to allow a contractor to get going. We'll then issue a footing and foundation permit, to get that piece in, then the structural frame permit, all the way up to a full building permit. So that generally works in the vast majority of cases to get builders constructing in a timely fashion.
Okay, great. Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
Mr. Ferguson.
A phased permit does work, but there's usually cost to the contractor to comply with the phased permit. A phased permit is no replacement to having a full permit. You're always limited by what you can do. Yes, the building department has worked with contractors by issuing phased permits, but it's not a very desirable solution. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ferguson. Any other additional comments or information about this ordinance or questions? Not seeing anyone in the queue. I guess we could move on to the next item in our agenda if you think we finished with this.
Yeah, just, Dean, if you would make that change regarding the audits, and then if I'll review for any other comments or anything, and then I'll send that over to the building board. I greatly appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Well, let's go down our agenda and we'll get to the item about the relocatable classrooms. And we could bring up that ordinance, the resolution. Thanks, Mandy. Yeah, this is something that was referred to this committee to take a look at. We were having a work session, the assembly had a work session on this, and there seemed to be a number of questions that came up at the time. And so we were given the instructions to take a more closer look at this. And so is there someone here that could answer questions if we had? Is someone here from the building department that could answer questions about this if someone from the committee had questions about it?
Through the chair, Ross Knopfsinger, representing the building department. I'm here.
Okay. All right, Ross. All right. Any members of the committee that have questions about this that they would like to discuss at this point?
So if I might, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Constant.
Thank you. I think in some ways we continue to face this bizarre forced perspective that the use of these structures must only be for emergency shelter. And if in fact they're used in any way for housing, we definitely need an intensive position from the building department that tells us how safe these can in fact be with the modifications that are being proposed. And so that doesn't even begin to get into, if we're thinking solely about them for use as shelter, how we manage the sites in which these places go in and how people get in and out of them and what we do about the ADA stuff. All of that's separate from the conversation that we have here related to building safety for these structures if we use them for housing vulnerable populations.
Well, correct. Obviously, one of the things that we were discussing was that some of these classrooms had only one door. And so if they were going to be used for housing, they would be required to add an additional door. And plus they're not current in their current iteration, they don't have plumbing in them. So if we moved them and we're going to be using them for housing, some sort of bathroom facility would have to be created either inside or outside of these buildings. And so it makes it a little more complicated to find a location that would be suitable for these, in my opinion. And since these buildings probably have not been moved in a number of years, they're not, from what I've seen, they're not set up on permanent foundations, so that makes them a little less stable. And if you're going to put people in them, living in them permanently, not just taking classes in them, they would have to be, we would have to make sure they were safer. And so a foundation is something that might be needed to be added, which would make it an additional expense, of course. And then, of course, there's a smoke alarm, and it would have to be checked or set up to make sure that those were all working. And I believe we have Mr. Rivera in the queue. Mr. Rivera?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I will readily admit that I am not prepared for this conversation. There have been a number of other things that have taken precedent in my world. So I guess what I need to know from the administration, and I'm not sure there's anyone here who can speak to this, but I'll put the questions on the record, is what direction does the administration need from us? So we have this ordinance before us. It'll come back on, I forget, did we postpone this to the 11th or the 25th?
25th.
Thank you. So let's say this ordinance comes back to us on the 25th and we approve it as is. Does the administration need further direction from us to look at using it as other purposes besides emergency shelter? So for example, to help out with storage of individuals' belongings as a component of the emergency shelter plan, but not necessarily as emergency shelter itself. Like, I need to know what type of direction the administration needs from us to allow these other possible uses that we were exploring.
All right, thank you, Mr. Rivera. That's a good question. And it seems like there would be less changes that would need to be made to these buildings if they were going to be used strictly for storage. They would have to find a location to move them to be used for that. Anyone from the administration online that might have Lance Wilbur, you're in the queue next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Lance Wilbur, Director at Community Development. Mr. Rivera, I will find out the answers to those questions. Those are questions that I have as well, and so I'll work with the administration to find out, if might there be other intended uses of the structures. To my I've only been informed that their current potential purpose would be just for emergency shelters, but I'll find an answer to your questions, but thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Wilbur. And if I may have a follow-up, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Rivera.
Thanks. So on top of that, one of the things that there appeared to be some consternation regarding at our last assembly meeting when we discussed this regarding simple acceptance of the portable buildings. Does the administration need a simple resolution, which, if they would like to offer and put forward for the assembly to consider, that would be great. Or if they seek a co-sponsorship, that's fine too. But a simple resolution saying we shall accept these portables as sort of step one. Because I think there was a little bit of concern about, well, if we push this ordinance too far, then we might not be able to accept the portables. We did get some communications from the school board that seemed to indicate that there was a little bit of wiggle room. But if a resolution helps the administration feel comfortable to accept the portables, then I'd like to know if that's what they want. And if so, could we possibly get that done at the October 11th meeting? Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera, and maybe Mr. Wilbur will be able to get back to us with that information as well.
Yes, thank you. Through the chair, Mr. Rivera, I will do that. Yeah, those are also questions on my mind. I'm interested in the conditions of the potential relocatables that we might be interested in, and where they're located and how they would get moved. I think Mr. Assembly Member Constant asked a lot of the similar questions that are outside this ordinance, and I will speak with the administration. But I think the intent of this ordinance is, if we wanted to do this, we would need to make an adjustment to the code if we wanted to accept the structures for purposes of emergency shelters. So, but I will get clarification on both.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mr. Wilbur. Mr. Salt.
Thanks, Mr. Peterson. So I like the idea of these, and I'm envisioning an ASD classroom that's certainly 4 walls and a roof to keep people dry, heated. That sounds good. I would like to see from the administration more of what that plan looks like. So in District 6, we had an organization that was going to do something similar, use relocatable barracks from, I believe, J-Bear. And those barracks had kitchens, had bathrooms, living rooms, bedrooms. So maybe a little bit better for a shelter. Again, this is an emergency shelter use for what I'm kind of reading. But I'd like to know how some of those other supports services would be met, as well as, and I know we don't have a location picked yet, but I think that'd be very helpful to know, what the full intent or use of these is going to be, and how that's going to, regardless of location, how that's going to play its way out. So if the administration can get that before the 25th as well, that would be great.
Okay, it's a good question, Mr. Salt. And, we probably should take into consideration, the expense of remodeling and repairing and moving these buildings compared to maybe buying buildings that have already been set up for, say, remote work, slope work, that are now available because there's not the demand for them up on the slope at this point. And so those, that we might actually take a look at those to see if they might actually be cheaper in the long run. But I saw a hand go up. Dean, you're next. Let's see.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Brian Dean, Anchorage Fire Department Fire Marshal. I just wanted, we looked at this as relocatable type of building. So certainly the ASD structures would fit that category, as well as the barracks that Assemblymember Salt mentioned. And so we can certainly take a look at those and see how they fit into this. We did have some suggested amendments to this. We think that these buildings provide a reasonable level of fire and life safety to be utilized on a limited occupant level. From my understanding, they have 2 exits from them. They're small enough that the occupant load would be limited. The existing ordinance already provides that sprinklers would not be required for these. The occupant levels that we anticipate fitting into these structures would not raise to the level of needing a sprinkler system. We would suggest that in the definitions section, where it defines what a publicly owned movable facility designated as emergency shelter is, similar to the provisions in Section A for the Group E occupancy, and this is on page 2, definitions starting at line 12, but specifically line 29. We would suggest that it be added an occupancy designation in that definition, and we would suggest it would be a Group R3 congregate living facility. I'm sorry, Group R3 transient congregate living facility. And that's just to be clear that occupant load would be 10 or less. When you start getting into higher occupant loads, then our need for additional life safety measures increase. And that also brings it in line more in harmony with the state regulations passed as well. In addition to that, since the sprinkler systems are exempt from in these structures, we would recommend that certainly single station smoke alarms are provided for these facilities, similar to that we would require to any other occupancy where overnight sleeping is permitted. But tied to that single station smoke alarm is a horn strobe type of setup for the exterior of the building, so that any sort of fire watch, any sort of administrative people doing oversight on this would know where there's an incident or emergency happening, and then also for first responders that are showing up to the site would be able to quickly identify which building needs to be responded to.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Dean. That was some good information. I appreciate that. And so if you suggested additional changes to Section A there, and maybe Mr. Gates could make those changes. I believe this is also still a draft. No, actually this isn't. We would have to make amendments to that on the 4, I believe. Go ahead. Anyway, I'm running into a pop-up ad situation here. Anyway, any other questions or comments about this ordinance about relocatable classrooms?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Constant.
Mr. Constant.
I just would second what Mr. Rivera said, that while there may be multiple uses for these, it feels like this ordinance is strangely narrow, and I don't know that I would support necessarily moving forward this project until we see a framework, how it would be done, where it would be done, because when you hear the fire inspector suggest a maximum of 10 per building, we're talking about 100 people, that's 10 buildings. Where do 10 buildings go? What's the infrastructure required to support them there? And what's a basic, again, rough order of magnitude plan for how this would work? So beyond authorization of this to where it could just be done by executive fiat, I would like to understand the bigger picture before I'm asked to vote yes, or before I'm able to vote yes, I should say.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Constant. And I was, if I'm remembering correctly, I thought they said that they weren't planning to use these till sometime next year, but that that might have been for homeless services. They might have intent to try to use them for storage this year. We still need to get communications from the administration on what their plans for the use of these facilities are. Additional questions or comments from members of the committee or from the administration on this item? Not seeing any hands raised. I believe this is the last item we have this morning on our agenda. And so we could go next to audience participation. Is there any member of the audience that would like to speak? You would have 3 minutes, and to unmute, I believe if you're calling in, would be *6. I am not seeing anyone. So I guess I will take a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Move to adjourn.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy this
Thank you.
beautiful sunny day.